Welcome, friends, to a program on Quakers and Capitalism, sponsored by Adult Religious Education Committee of Central Philadelphia Quaker Meeting. I'm Stephen Davison, and I've done this program a few times before. When I was going over past notes, I discovered that I had actually done this program for Central Philadelphia Meeting in 2019, and I'd forgotten that. So I'm hoping that you all have forgotten it too, or that at least you'll find this version of it worthwhile. And as I was adapting my notes from past times, late in the game, unfortunately, I realized that I really wanted to take a different approach this time. And this new outline never completely settled in properly. So I'm going to be winging it a little bit some of the time, I think, and hope that the Spirit guides me better than my rational mind has so far. The earlier versions of this have focused on the history of Quaker fortunes and a history of Quaker contributions to capitalist culture, especially industrial capitalism. And I want to focus this time. I want to sort of zoom through that history a bit to give background and context. But this time, I really want to focus on the dynamics inside the movement relating to our economic system as a context for a new approach or a discussion of what our testimony on economic justice might look like today, and our social action regarding capitalism might look like today. I think you can divide Quaker history, especially Quaker economic history, into 4 periods, with transition periods in between that more or less span the turns of the centuries. Those 4 periods are the 1650s, or what we have come to call the Lamb's War, or to quote the title of Doug Gwynn's book, The Apocalypse of the Word. And in that period, Quakers assaulted the establishment, but mostly the religious establishment, and mostly, well, completely really, from a sort of apocalyptic religious perspective. As a sort of side effect, they ended up assaulting the social order itself through their plain speech and their hat honor practices, in particular, undermining the stratified social class system of Britain at the time. But that really wasn't their goal. It just happened that they believed they were called to these practices out of faithfulness to their understanding of Scripture and the leadership of Christ, and that when Christ remade the social order, these things would be changed as a result, sort of indirectly in a way. I want to focus mostly on the first transition period and the last transition period. The first one starts in 1661, and we could say it ends in 1691 when George Fox dies. The last one was around the turn of the 20th century, and the last one echoes some of the themes of the first one, but in a kind of upside down way. In 1661, Charles II was restored to the throne. The monarchy was reestablished. The radical Puritan experiment came to a crashing end. And Parliament passed the Quaker Act and then a number of other acts that were used as weapons of the church and the state to destroy Quakerism. And all of them, all of these acts were either economic in their initial impact, in their intended impact, or as a side effect. And so each of these transition periods got external forces in the wider society that affect Quakers, and internal forces within the movement that bring about these radical changes in Quaker culture. And the external force, two external forces were really important in this first transition between, say, 1661 and 1700. The first were these persecutions, and the imprisonments that went along with it. By the time Fox came out of his first imprisonment in 1663, maybe, almost all of the leadership of the Quaker movement had died in prison. Penn, in his introduction to Fox's journal, says that to a certain degree, Quakerism survived because George Fox's body was so robust. He made it through all those imprisonments without dying, but his contemporary leaders did not. And it's hard to exaggerate how intense the economic assault on Quakers were. In the 1650s, the first Friends were yeoman farmers in the northwest of England, or small town tradespeople. Yeomen were people who owned their own farms, but had no relationship, political or economic, with the manor, with the lords of the manor and the manorial system. They were freeholders in their own right. And the economic assault included fines, imprisonment, fines, and distrainments. A distrainment was when, if you didn't have enough money to pay the fine, they took the means of your production. They took the tools of your trade as payment. So the state systematically drove Quakers off their farms and out of their trades. And let me see if I can find a quote for you on this, a number. I thought I had a note for this. Oh yeah, here it is. By 1700, the state had extracted 1,125,000 pounds out of the Quaker community through tithe fines alone for the refusal to pay the tithe that supported the Church of England. The law that required a payment of tithe to support the church was only repealed in the 1850s. And Quakers continued to be brought to trial over refusal to pay this tithe deep into the 19th century. But we're talking about 1.125 million pounds in 30 years for just one thing, when a living wage was 40 pounds a year. To deal with this onslaught, Fox established what he called gospel order, which was an institutional apparatus designed to keep Quakers going because the leadership was now gone. One of the most important things he did was establish monthly and quarterly meetings, and a number of other institutions and reforms of practice that made it possible to keep things together and to control Quakers. to keep them from causing trouble for the movement. Because we could call this transition period after the title of one of Doug Gwynn's other books, the Covenant Crucified. The radical expectation of the inbreaking of the second coming of Christ was abandoned in this period. And Quakers cut a deal with the state and the church. And they said, if we leave you alone, you can leave us alone. And we withdrew into ourselves. And by the time it was over, more or less, 1700, we had become one of the wealthiest communities in Great Britain. There were, I think, 17 Quaker families whose annual income was greater than £100,000 a year. 80% of Friends during what I call the double culture period were in the upper class, while 80% of Great Britain was in the lower class. Margot, last time I went through this, asked me, how was that possible? How did we become fabulously wealthy while we were being stripped of our wealth systematically by the state? I didn't really have a good answer for her, so I've been researching ever since. And I think I do have an answer. This period is the period in which the textile industry in Great Britain gets launched. And Friends were, these farmers that were driven off their farms were already sheep herders. As Paul can attest, there's sheep all over the place in Sedberg and the other towns where Friends came from in the first place. Still, it's still sheep country. So Friends already had a connection to the wool trade in Great Britain. And the wool trade became the backbone of the British textile industry. And the British Empire was just getting going. The Spanish Armada had been decisively defeated in 1688. And they were basically alone except for the Dutch. And international trade had been going on for a century, basically, in things like spices and sugar and rum, and of course, humans. So there was this new class of wealth in Great Britain that was built on international trade, but it was all about trade. At this point, England becomes an exporter and a controller of a brand new industry. And Quakers were forced into the heart of that industry at the moment it was getting going. In a sort of similar way that Bill Gates stumbled in to the beginning of the PC economy with the first operating system. And we rode England's economy into a new economy. Until then, the mercantile system was the crown chartered businesses and controlled them, set some prices, and gave them monopolies. But the money was for the crown. The money was for the state. When Adam Smith wrote his book in 1776, he was still concerned with what affects the state economically. But around this time, private capital emerges, and individual groups of investors are for the first time legally able to incorporate for money. So an all new capitalist system emerges, built around textiles, and Quakers are at the center of it. But I call this period the double culture period, because Friends withdrew from almost every area of social contact with wider culture, except business and industry, and science and technology. And in these areas, they could not have been more important. And I'm not going to get into detail, but if you want the detail, I've put a bunch of links in the chat. One of them is labeled Quaker Contributions to Industrial Capitalism, and it's basically an annotated list of the innovations Quakers created, many of which made industrial capitalism possible. And I'm just going to touch on the ones that were really, really important. The first was they revitalized the coal industry, both the coal and the iron industry in Great Britain. And they invented a new form of fuel called coke that burned hotter, which made a new kind of cast iron possible. They invented the railroad. They invented iron rails for the railroad. And they invented the iron truss bridge. And for the first time, it's possible to move very heavy goods long distances any season of the year. Because when it rains in England, the roads turn to mud and you can't take it by wagon if it's loaded with ingots of iron. They invented cast steel, which made mass production of machines possible. Machines mass produce goods. Cast steel made it possible to mass produce machines. So it was an exponential explosion of capability in the Industrial Revolution. And the list just goes on and on. For 150 years, Quakers supplied all the silver for the Bank of England. Sterling silver was Quaker silver. We invented a new navigational clock that worked much better than the ones that had been used. We invented, with cast steel, the Sheffield cutlery business, which was the very beginnings, that and the replaceable time for a plow of the consumer economy, where we almost literally invented the consumer economy, because all these businesses were producing a middle class who could buy things instead of making them. And so a whole new economy designed to make the things that people didn't want to have to make themselves anymore grew up. And we were essential to the beginnings of that. We were the venture fund capital that finished the steam engine. Lloyd's of London was the first bank to diversify its holdings and not just be a clearinghouse for an individual industry. We owned all of the really big banks in England. The Bank of Norwich, which is the Gurney family bank, was the second largest bank in England after the Bank of England. So the list just goes on and on and on about how important Quakers were to the Industrial Revolution. There was a second transition period around the turn of the 19th century that saw the emergence of evangelicalism as a theology, and coincidentally, causally, actually, the emergence of a new economic theory of economic politics, started by Thomas Malthus of the famous Malthusian theory, who was an evangelical minister. And in those days, economists were all moral philosophers. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. I'm not going to get into detail, but the 1800s saw the rise of evangelical political economy in Great Britain for at least half a century. And it's a fascinating story in its own right. But I want to fast forward to the second transition period, which you can see it starting in the 1880s. It really got going for us in the liberal branch in 1895. In the 1880s, the evangelical Orthodox branch of Quakers in America began experimenting with and eventually shifted decisively toward pastoral ministry, and program worship. And in 1887, they held a conference in Richmond, Indiana, the Richmond Conference, in which they basically settled that they were going to have pastors and they were going to have services like all the other Protestant churches, and it was okay. And to push back on the innovations that were taking place in the Wilburite branch and the Hicksite branch. And in a kind of reaction or inspiration caused by the Richmond Conference, British Friends held a conference in 1895 in Manchester. The Manchester Conference is the moment when liberal Quakerism first appears. And the 1890s were a really fascinating, active decade. Let me get to my notes here so that I don't miss what I want to say. The external event that really affected Quaker economics, Quaker fortunes, was the final decision by the US Supreme Court and the final decision by the House of Lords, which was at the time the Supreme Court of Great Britain, to put the final touches on limited liability corporate law. And now, for the first time, it was possible for anybody to get together with anybody and form a corporation. And a stock market for that purpose was, of course, immediately set up, where the stock markets that were already set up shifted to this new business model. And one by one, the great Quaker-owned families issued IPOs and went public. And over the next 20 to 30 years, the great Quaker family fortunes were deconstructed. And their businesses became publicly owned, and the members of the families who wanted to be involved in the business became managers in businesses their families had owned. The Cadburys, who invented the Kit Kat, became Cadbury chocolate, and some of the Cadburys remained in business with the business for a while, but gradually family members left their businesses. Meanwhile, two religious movements were born that had a big impact on Quakerism. The first was the social gospel movement, which was focused on reading the gospel in ways that would help the poor and the disenfranchised. And alongside it emerged the Pentecostal movement, which in its very beginnings was a very egalitarian and multiracial phenomenon. At the same time, science and technology is going bananas. All kinds of things are being developed, the gramophone, the electricity, our understanding of the atom for the first time in some ways. And of course, further confirmation of Darwin's theory of evolution. And socially, this began to have an impact on the way people approached religion. If God created a universe that's evolving, then it's okay for religions to evolve too. And this was sort of one way to explain the impulse behind the emergence of liberal Quakerism. It started off as a reaction to the ossified, strict culture of eldership that had dominated Quakerism until then, with recorded ministers and recorded elders, and and young people wanted this is a young adult movement. They wanted They want a vocal ministry that mattered, that spoke to their condition, that spoke to the problems they saw around them, instead of one more rant about how you shouldn't sin, and if you did, you were going to hell. And so they began, like they did in America, gathering, where they were doing revivals. In Great Britain, they began study groups, and they began inviting people to speak about, the issues of the day from a religious point of view, and so on. One more external movement that really matters is progressivism. When McKinley was elected president in the 1890s, he restructured the Republican Party from the party of Lincoln and Reconstruction to the party of big business. And then he was assassinated, and Teddy Roosevelt became president, and he was a progressivist, which was a broadly sort of vague movement that had eventually a political party that was focused on using the social sciences to solve human problems in all areas, but a kind of technocrat sort of social movement. If we understand the problem, we can come up with some ideas, we can test them out, and if they don't work, we'll try something else until we fix it. In the midst of this comes Seabohm Rowntree, my favorite Quaker. He's a member of the Rowntree chocolate family. Actually, it was the Rowntrees that invented the Kit Kat, not the Cadburys. I'm sorry. The Rowntree family was an important one. His father, I think it was, John Stevenson Rowntree, as a 24-year-old, had answered the call for essays that analyzed why Quaker membership was declining so radically, and for solutions to the problem. And in 1859, at the age of 24, he won that contest. He won 100 pounds for an essay that basically said, well, we're declining because we disown people for owning pianos, for God's sake. We disown them for marrying Presbyterians. We're destroying ourselves. And in 2 years, London Yearly Meeting turned on a dime and rewrote its faith and practice to stop doing a lot of the things he recommended. So that's the kind of family that Seabohm came from. His brother, John Wilhelm Rowntree, was Rufus Jones's close friend. And between the two of them, they were the masterminds of the liberal revolution in Quakerism. Rowntree suffered from an illness that I don't remember the nature of, and died tragically young, but by all accounts was a religious genius and an extremely charismatic young man. But back to Rowntree. In the early 1890s, a man named Charles Booth published in 17 volumes the very first statistical sociological survey study. He interviewed tens of thousands of people in London who were in the poor class, in the working class. And his volumes were, nobody read them because they were so dense with tables and graphs and hard to read text. And there were so many of them that only some intelligentsia in London read it. But one of them was Seabohm Rowntree. And Booth's conclusion was that that contrary to what the evangelical economists of the time, and all economists essentially, were saying, poor people are not poor because of their character, because they drink too much, because they gamble too much, because they have too much sex and they have too many kids, which was what Malthus was worried about. No, poor people are poor because they don't get paid enough. This was revolutionary. He proved that most poor people in London worked. They just didn't make enough money. He invented what we now call the poverty line, a formula that defined how much you needed to stay alive as a family. And the intelligentsia of London were all worked up about this, but nobody was clear what to do about it. Rowntree went back to York, where his hometown, where his chocolate factory and the railroad were the only businesses in town. And it was a relatively small town, nothing like London. And he borrowed Charles Booth's method, and he interviewed tens of thousands of people in York. And he published a book called Poverty, A Study in Town Life, that made the same point that Booth did. Poor people are not poor because of their character. They are poor because the system is structurally crushing them. This book became a bestseller. Lloyd George, it fell into the hands of a young conservative MP named Winston Churchill. And Churchill said it brought tears to his eyes to read this book. And he and Lloyd George went on a campaign. Lloyd George would wave the book as he gave speeches all over England saying, "This book proves you are not the problem. The owners of the businesses are the problem." And for the first time since the Lamb's War, Quakers were awakening to the structural problems of the capitalist system. Rowntree went on to help engineer the welfare state in Great Britain, along with Churchill and Lloyd George. And he entered public service and worked for the government on and off until he died in the late 50s. And their insight was, if businesses won't reform on their own, which they obviously aren't, and they are the problem, then the only solution we have left is the state. The state has to regulate business. And so Quaker witness life took a shift. And then came World War I. And now, for the first time since the persecutions of the 1600s, the state is once again persecuting Quakers for their conscience and throwing them in jail as conscientious objectors. And this galvanized Quaker meetings in a way that they'd never been touched before. They had to decide what they were going to do about their conscientious objectors and about the people who conscripted and joined the army. What are we going to do about this? And an international Quaker conversation about what the testimonies meant started. And we came out of it with the testimonies, with a self-consciousness about our witness stance in the world that we had not had before. And meanwhile, Rufus Jones and some of his friends had created the service committees to be, ambulance drivers in World War I and to take care of the people who were starving to death after the war was over in Europe and so on. And simultaneously, in 1920, Britain Yearly Meeting, well, it was London Yearly Meeting then, and Philadelphia Yearly Meeting both laid down their traditional culture of eldership and stopped recording ministers. And the structure of witness life in Quaker meetings changed. It used to be that if you wanted to do something like John Woolman did, you had to go to your meeting and get a minute for travel or service. Now we're forming committees. And this got a kickstart in 1915 in Britain Yearly Meeting, when the yearly meeting, actually, you know what, I'm going to back up. I want to tell the story of how I got involved in this interest personally. In 1990, I had a leading that I should write a book, basically biblical scholarship, about Christian earth stewardship. So in the winter and spring terms of 1991, I went to Pendle Hill to start research. And one day I was in the library looking for something, and I happened across the proceedings of the First World Conference of Friends in 1920. And right next to it, or very near it, was the proceedings of London Yearly Meeting in 1918. In those days, London Yearly Meeting held, they had a different process for yearly meetings than we do. They asked for prepared messages on topics that they came up with, and then they held open meetings for vocal ministry in response to these short messages. And the messages and the vocal ministry was recorded in the proceedings. And the 1920 proceedings of the World Conference mentioned the 8 principles of a true social order, for which there's a link in the chat. And it mentioned that they had come from London Yearly Meetings proceedings, or London Yearly Meeting in 1918. So I went to that one and I read that and got the full story. That in 1915, they had convened a committee on war and the social order, charged with understanding what had caused the Great War and what they should do about it. In 1916, the committee came back with a report, and something called the 7 points of the message to all friends. And this caused an uproar because it basically blamed capitalism for the war. And the yearly meeting could not come to unity on these 7 points. So they sent them back to the quarterly meetings, asking the quarterly meetings to look at them and write a report back. And the reports you get from these quarterly meetings are fascinating. Some quarters said, this doesn't go far enough. Capitalism is evil. And some said, what are you talking about? You're talking about our businesses, you know. And so there was this incredible, intense internal conflict that came to a head in 1918 at the yearly meeting sessions when these quarterly meeting reports came back. And the yearly meeting finally settled on the 8 principles of a true social order, which are somewhat watered down, but still pretty radical. They don't quite blame capitalism for the war, but they do, but they do suggest some really important things. And this got brought to the 1920 conference. This conflict intrigued me. I was fascinated by the cognitive dissonance created by trying to understand the war and the economic background of the war. And I wanted to know more. And the more I studied, the more I saw that paradoxes like this litter our history. How many people here have heard of John Bellers? For a long time, Bellers may have been the second most famous Quaker in history, assuming that William Penn is the first most and that Richard Nixon doesn't count. Now, some people might say that Herbert Hoover is the most famous Quaker, and I think they have a point. Maybe so. Really, though, the most famous Quaker is almost certainly Judi Dench. But a lot of people don't know she's a Quaker. And right behind Judi Dench is Bonnie Raitt. But a lot of people don't know she's a Quaker either. Why would this guy, John Bellers, who lived in the early 1700s, be the second most famous Quaker in history, because one of his writings found its way into Friedrich Engels's hands, and he put it in Das Kapital and named him by name. And as a result, John Bellers was required reading in the Soviet Union by Soviet students. So all these Soviet students had heard of John Bellers, and meanwhile, most Quakers have never heard of the guy. And that's because his basic point was, no, the owners don't make wealth, workers make wealth. Without workers, there's nothing. And he also did a number of other things. He was a truly extraordinary man. He was the first person in the English-speaking world to call for an end to capital punishment. He proposed that there should be medical journals so that doctors could keep up with the latest. He proposed that drugs should be tested to make sure they actually work. That doctors should be certified by a board. All these things were new innovations that this extraordinary man came up with. And why have we mostly, when we are so fascinated, so basically obsessed with our own history, have we forgotten that we invented cast steel? We know that we invented the Kit Kat. We might know that Lever Brothers was originally a Quaker company. We might know that Barclay Bank is basically a Quaker bank. But there's an amnesia in Quakers. And one of the things that characterized liberal Quakerism at the turn of the century was a discovery of Quaker history. And the so-called Roundtree History Series was started. It was named after this fellow Roundtree who died young. The Braithwaite histories of the beginnings of Quakerism and the second period of Quakerism. And then Rufus Jones wrote several more volumes. Quakers discovered their own history as a self-identity. And yet, it wasn't until 1930 something that a biography of Bellers was written, and it never got across the pond to the United States. So I wanted to know what's behind this. It's almost a collective neurosis. And I'm wondering whether we are living in a new transition period ourselves. Let's look at the external forces that may be driving a change in Quaker fortunes and maybe in our relationship to the economic system. First of all, there's globalization of businesses and markets and infrastructure, in which not only individuals and households and communities like our towns and our cities, but even whole nations are helpless against what these corporations do. And the corporations themselves have evolved. They started out being family-owned and regional, and then they became national, and then they became transnational, and then they became multinational, and now they're meta-national. Corporations are essentially countries unto themselves, and some of them almost literally. ExxonMobil is in a relationship to Trinidad and Tobago that's very similar to the relationship that mining companies had to their mining towns. They're like the company town of Trinidad and Tobago. Nothing happens without ExxonMobil saying okay. And in return, they help fund the schools and roads and public infrastructure and so on. I'm just waiting for the day when ExxonMobil asks for a seat in the United Nations using Trinidad and Tobago as a proxy. We've become increasingly individualistic throughout the liberal period. The whole, bowling alone phenomenon. And the economy has become not just globalized, but financialized. The great wealth, the great fortunes of the 18th and 19th centuries were built on an industrial model. The great fortunes of the 20th century were added corporate capitalism as a new model. And of course, then we had the digital revolution. But now the great fortunes are built on just moving money. The really, really rich people of the world don't actually make anything. They sell and buy financial instruments. And internally, there's a bunch of things going on. First of all, there's Quaker decline. There's the troubling convergence of three curves in Quaker institutional fortunes. Quaker membership is falling, and giving by the existing membership is falling, and the fixed costs of the institutions is rising. And this is squeezing all of our institutions, and they are systematically dropping programs and laying people off. Sooner or later, these curves will converge, and some of these institutions will begin to collapse. I have a concrete example of how this works. When I was still in New York Yearly Meeting, Powell House, which is the conference center, had a capital campaign to massively rebuild its youth center, which was in really terrible shape. They had a 3-year campaign that got interrupted by the Great Recession, so they extended it to a 4th year. And they raised almost all the money that they wanted, which was more than $1 million. By the time their campaign, their capital campaign was over, the people who had provided 75% of that money had died. 3/4 of the wealth base of that campaign died before it was over. At the same time, when we all shifted into the middle class with the demise of the great Quaker fortunes in the early 20th century, now the erosion of the middle class is pulling us down into the lower classes. I mean, it doesn't look like it yet for a lot of us. You know, we're moving into folkways or Kendall, a lot of us. We're holding on, a lot of us. Many of us are still truly middle class. But that won't be true for our kids, or a lot of them anyway. And we're going to be spending an awful lot of what we've got left at Kendall or wherever. And so what do we do? And what do we think about capitalism? What do we think about the economy? We've actually never had a coherent, articulated testimony on the economic system as a system. As early as George Fox, we had testimonies on how you should conduct yourself in business. We've had a testimony on money, but not on the economic system per se, except for these outliers like John Bellers and Seabohm Roundtree. Until now. Now we have George Lakey's book on Viking economics. Now we have Pamela Haynes's books and the other writings that have come out of the Quaker Institute for the Future, which is an interesting, wonderful echo of a committee. You know, in 1918, when London Yearly Meeting decided to approve this watered down version of the principles, the socialists and radicals who were pushing for a much more hard line on capitalism formed a new committee, of course, called the Committee on Industry and the Social Order. And they produced all kinds of really great radical stuff deep into the middle of the 20th century in both Philadelphia Yearly Meeting and London Yearly Meeting. And we've come up with some institutions that more or less directly address structural problems in the economy. The one that really comes to mind foremost is right sharing of world resources. But our faith and practice doesn't have anything specifically about it. It's got sentences that refer to it under family life in the home, under social justice, and under stewardship. What do we think about capitalism? If we hold it up to our testimonies, for instance, let's say the peace testimony. This was the origins of the whole thing in 1918. It was the peace testimony that drove their interest in the economy. Capitalism is inherently competitive. It's built on competition. Competition always leads to conflict, by definition. Conflict sometimes leads to violence. Mining companies using the Pinkertons to gun down strikers, for instance. And wars, of course, over resources, markets, whatever. Can we make a case that capitalism is inherently violent? Equality. The capitalism's mission is to make money, not to take care of people. And it's inherently undemocratic, unless it's, well, you can't really call a co-op capitalist. The owners of a capitalist corporation run the corporation. Well, actually, that's not true. Shareholders now, you know, there's no such thing as a shareholder, really. There's the whole myth about shareholder value. It's a myth. Shareholders are like pension funds. They're organizations primarily, and those of us who have some investments. But we don't have any say over what those corporations do. The shareholders get, theoretically, they get the money, but they don't really have much control. So there's a managerial class that controls the company on behalf of this mythical shareholder, quote unquote, in theory. Earth care, of course, is an obvious no-brainer. If constant growth is the armature of the engine of capitalism, if a business that fails to grow is deemed in trouble, then you can call this economy carcinomic. It's a cancer by definition. It's an organism that never stops growing. When will it stop? It will never stop, not until it's consumed everything it needs to grow. And just as tuberculosis was the disease of the 19th century because of coal, cancer is the disease of the carcinomic economy in the 20th century. Because of the waste, primarily, I hope, I think, I wonder. Integrity, capitalism deliberately misdefines its accounting. It refuses to account in its bottom line for the damage it does to its capital base, the earth, and the damage it does to its capital base through pollution and waste. if we paid the true cost of the consumption, the extraction, and the waste, we wouldn't be able to afford anything. So we don't account for it. So capitalism lies to itself about its own accounting system. Of course, it's perfectly willing to destroy communities on behalf of profit. So it has no testimony of community anymore. I think it did at one time. And of course, it has no integrity. It lies to us constantly, all the time, through advertising. And as I just said, it lies to itself about its own accounting system. So I want to dedicate the last half hour here to an open discussion with a couple of queries. Is capitalism inherently evil? Is it inherently unjust and violent? Or does it just need reforming? Can it be reformed? Or is it past fixing? If we decide that a mass production, mass consumption economy is inherently violent and or unjust, what do we do about it? What kind of an economy could replace the mass production of goods and the consumption of goods? And if so, what would our testimony on the capitalist system be? And how would we act on it? Those are my queries. Oh, one more query. Given the momentum behind Quaker decline and the threat to Quaker institutions, how can we restructure ourselves? Joan?
I want to address your first question. I was raised by American communists who believed that capitalism was inherently evil. And I tried to resist that and just think about individual issues and how we could deal with them and so on. And I'm coming now in my old age, when my parents are long gone, to think, yeah, they were right. Their solution wasn't right. I don't know what the solution is. But it is true that capitalism is inherently undemocratic, anti everybody except the people at the top. And what do? I can't answer that second question, because the solution of following the Soviet Union was not helpful.
I'd like to throw in something here that I think Americans have allowed our economy to become our dominant structure, dominant social and cultural structure from which all of us take our cues and order and organize ourselves. And I think that that is inside out. The environment is actually the structure and the dominant structure that all humans have to organize themselves around. The economy is a subset, if you will, of the environment. And yet we've allowed ourselves to believe and organize our lives inside out. And that is really causing our destruction. I don't think that any economic system is inherently anything, to be frank. And it's not a religion. It's not, it's not inherently evil. It's not inherently good, and neither is communism, and neither is dictatorship, and neither is any form of economy that we humans have ever concocted, and it won't be. I don't think that's uh, you know I think what we've got, frankly, at this moment is not enough time left to stabilize not only the economy, but the environment. And that's where we need to focus. And I think if we focus there, other things fall into position and fall into place. And it worries me that we continue to make the economy more important than it is.
Jonathan?
Thank you very much, Steve. Listening to your talk, a lot of what you said made me think about the difference between want and need. And I think that there are a lot of things that that point out the faults of the effects of capitalism. But you could also fault capitalism for its very design. It could be that back in the late 1700s, when Adam Smith was writing about the invisible hand, he was thinking about that invisible hand serving the many needs of all of society. But I think the state of capitalism today it's much more about what people want, and they buy what they want, and they make economic decisions about what they want. There was many years ago, I found a poster published by British Yearly Meeting, and it shows a pail of water, and the simple caption at the bottom is, "What is needed?" Question mark. I think that this it's almost a meta query. What is needed? And I've seen it come up quite a lot in Quaker circles. That question is a question that can unite and bring us to cooperation, whereas what is wanted, what do we want? It's much more about individual goals, and it seems that divides. So when you ask about capitalism being evil, I think that this is one of the roots of that. I am still thinking quite a lot about what you've shared with us, and so I don't have an answer to that yet. I'm really looking forward to hearing others and their responses.
I wonder about the term economic democracy, and are the problems of capitalism and the managerial class related to the vast inequality in the ownership of the corporations through shares? I am skeptical about reform elements that just have, workers getting a certain percentage of shares or something like that. But it seems that if there were more equality of ownership of large corporations, of the economic infrastructure, that it may be part of the solution, or it may be a reform that could ameliorate things. I don't know. I think of the Scandinavian countries, both Sweden and Norway, having very large investments through the national pension systems of the shares of those of Norwegian and Swedish companies. And that has been increased at times when there's been more government intervention in order to save corporate structures at times of crisis. I have a feeling that this is has lots of problems with it, and one of the problems is our nation states. I mean, if you have a population that's small and wealthy, as the Swedish population or the Norwegian population, or even the American population compared to the whole world, then are we just managing corporations in the interests of those world elites rather than the real needs of the mass of people of the earth? But dealing with extension of democracy to the economic sphere may be a part of it.
I think capitalism as it operates today in this country and in most of the world is evil. I don't think it would need to be evil if it were strenuously regulated. What I'm speaking of is what I call unfettered capitalism, which is whatever can be done will be done. And the corporate executives will make millions and billions every year. And the people who actually do the work might make $10 an hour if they're lucky. I think that kind of inequitable distribution of wealth is evil. However, that's my value system. It's based on my values, it's based on my faith, it's based on my religious belief. I think a lot of people don't have that same value system. I think a lot of people believe if you can make money, great, more power to you, go for it. But I think in order to have a world economy that's closer to what my image of God would want it to be, would involve a spiritual evolution of everyone in the world. It would involve people really believing that resources should be equitably distributed. And I think we're far from that belief, not only because we consume a lot of spiritually empty media, but also because we're emotionally immature and deprived. And emotionally, many of us feel better when we can see ourselves as more wealthy than others, as better off than others. It makes us feel better. So we have an emotional investment in maintaining poor, not gospel, but poor spiritual order. I don't think these problems are easily fixed. I don't know of an economic system that's better than capitalism, but I do believe that if we're to continue to be a capitalist country, we need to have more regulation of the division of resources. We can't keep having CEOs who make billions of dollars a year while workers struggle to earn a living wage and in most cases cannot.
George?
I so appreciate this conversation because I do experience the topic as hugely about our faith, hugely about the spiritual dimension. And I'm grateful that everybody's responding in that way as well. The question, one reason why I was drawn into interest in especially the Nordic countries and wrote that book, especially about Norway, but the other Nordic countries too, was because of this innovative approach that you kept emphasizing, Stephen, that Quakers have a history of being very innovative. We see the world freshly and how about this, how about that? And so when Norway discovered oil in the North Sea, it was highly innovative. It said, okay, so this belongs to the whole people, right? It certainly shouldn't be privately owned. It should be owned by the whole people. And therefore, the benefits of it should be available in an equitable way to the whole people. We should all benefit from this. And we don't want to do a get rich quick thing. And so we want to put the profits aside in a pension fund so the generations and generations that we can't even picture in the future will benefit from this treasure that we've discovered, and so on and so on. It's so innovative were they in their approach. Well, one of the things, they had no idea what to do with it, right? They didn't have the skills there. So they made deals with the international corporations that know how to do oil on the basis of, you have to pay our workers the way we pay our workers. You have to do occupational health and safety the way we do it. You have to do all these things, by our standards. So there's this tiny country ordering Exxon and the others around as a condition for them being able to work. So that whole freshness and innovative character was really, really encouraging to me. So the last election in Norway, it was so appalling to the Americans that our government refused to invite Norway to the next meeting. It was our turn to host all the oil exporting nations, and refused to invite Norway to the party because it was so outraged by the policy that the Norwegians came up with. And so I liked that. I appreciated that a whole lot. And of course, continued to follow oil politics in Norway, and was very discouraged a couple of weeks ago when the current election did not bring into power in the government the left and progressive and ecologically most concerned part of the multiple political parties they've got over there, but instead brought into power a coalition of parties that said in their platforms, yeah, we'll continue to develop the oil, and we'll use the money that we get out of continued developing the oil for supporting our greenifying, and we're greening like crazy, and we're buying slices of the jungle in Brazil and so on to keep them from being deforested, and we're doing all these great things for the environment, and the money that we get from the oil and gas helps us to do all that. So aren't we great? And they're not being great at all, of course. And so, but they haven't been able to manage, the Norwegians haven't managed to create a majority of people who would agree with us, that the oil and gas should stay in the ground. And as I've been puzzling about this, I've been realizing a point that you made, Stephen, which is that each economic system brings its own set of values. And that's why this is also a religious concern for us. The value of capital itself, right? That money has this enormous attraction within the capitalist system of values that can outweigh such a basic thing as the future for Norwegian grandchildren who are already being hurt, but will be hurt much more by an earth that we can't even imagine. So it's just so much, and even though I in my book, I point out multiple ways that it's democracy that's in charge in Norway, not the corporate elite that's in charge in Norway, and so on. A lot of ways they've enabled values to play the central role in how they handle their society, as compared with us. We allow the economic elite to run us. They insist on the people running, but it's still democracy, and therefore that appeal of capital, preserve the capital. It's still there.
John?
I'm feeling a fundamental issue, contradiction even in what Steve has said, which I think is true, that capitalism needs growth. And what Jonathan talked about, the issue of want versus need. I struggle with what I want versus what I need. I think we all do. And I for one don't struggle with it very intelligently. But what capitalist system needs is for us to want what we don't really need. If we only wanted what we needed, it wouldn't work for the capitalists.
Right.
Paul?
Man, this has been such a rich discussion. There are so many wheels spinning. I guess it's just to go back to some of your queries, there were so many. I don't think capitalism inherently is evil, but it sure does some nasty business. And that seems to be part of the character of it. And so I support the ideas of reeling that in and regulating that and redistributing. There was a couple of efforts along with the Quaker Institute for the Future through yearly meeting that I used to participate in. One was called the Growth Dilemma Project, which was something I learned about when I heard the name. I'm like, wow, now that is a fascinating concept. And basically it was a really interesting group that monthly got together and had a lot of pretty in-depth economic discussions, and some papers came out of it. But then that led to some of Pamela's recent and other publications, and the Quaker Institute for the Future was integrated in that. Then the name was changed to the Friends economic integrity project. People thought the growth dilemma was not encompassing enough, although that certainly is a major challenge, because I look at capitalism like it's this big shark. And if you know about sharks, they have to move. They can't bring in water. They have to keep moving. So they have to keep moving and devouring things to stay alive. And I think capitalism does that. There's so many things that came out of the era you started with in the early days of Quakerism. There was something going on called the Enclosure Acts, which continued for centuries, really. But it really brought to light the force of private property and how private property has taken over our lives and the way we think about our stuff, mine, our stuff. And it used to be ours like a big hour, and we got to share it. And there was this concept of breaking it up, privatizing it, and making it more, in a sense, productive, has continued to this day. George just referred to it when he talked about the oil. Well, of course, it's going to be everybody's oil. Well, good luck keeping that, because the force of privatization is incredible. It's like, Frederick Douglass and many others speak about the powerful are not going to give up power willingly. It isn't like this is going to happen easily. When I think about the moral element, that is really huge. And we as people of faith, I think, need to set an example and to talk and to get out our example, because our little bit of money is just a little blip in what's going on, but we can set some examples. When Adam Smith wrote, there was so many things were just starting. There wasn't this incredibly globalized world with major industrialization. And the concept of the invisible hand always troubled me. Like, the invisible hand, like, is that God? How does that work? I mean, how does that just like, oh, you can just go do what the heck you want, look out for your interest, and it's good for everybody. Wow, that sounds like letting everybody off the hook, right? But I think in the small communities that he saw in Scotland, where he did most of his research, and he was a moral philosopher, as you brought up, the assumption was almost that people were moral. They had some kind of religious underpinning, and that they went about their business. And yes, they did what was good for them, but they knew about their neighbor, and they knew about people downtown and cities away. There was a connection, and I think that connection is now no longer there. We have these mega international corporations. They don't know about those people in other countries. They're not connected to them. It's not personal anymore. And it is more about the bottom line. So I've always felt like the invisible hand had an invisible arm connected to an invisible heart. And there was soul, and there was a moral connection. And we're talking a lot about how do we get that back into the system? And our country has worked so hard to get it out, like, oh, that's a separate thing you do one day a week, or you do that privately, while we just keep cranking out stuff, and you're just having a good time looking for it and buying it and showing it off and talking to your neighbor about it. So it's so complicated. It's so rich what you're talking about. I thank everybody for their contributions. I hope that we can continue this and come up with some examples of how to help reel in this monster that's pretty much out of control. And I guess you referred to, it doesn't even just, it's hypocritical in the sense it doesn't even work as a real economic system, because it doesn't recognize what are called externalities, like pollution, and how it's abused the environment, which are very limited resources that are ours in common.
Rita? You're muted, Rita.
I'm going back to some of the things I mentioned when we were in the breakout session, in which I think we're all made with, we have that of God in us, our higher consciousness. And I think Carl Jung talked about it as the greater self. And then we've got this ego separated self, which is a lower level of consciousness. And when we move toward relation with anything from one of these levels, we're pointing either toward harmony of being in the collective oneness, or we're moving into separation, which is this morning in the breakout session, we were talking about it as reflecting in any kind of addiction. And of course, the classic examples are drug addiction or alcoholism. But in the last couple of days, it's just been coming up bigger and bigger in my awareness that absolutely anything we're drawn to, if we're moving towards it from one of our lower levels of consciousness, we're moving into rejection of connecting with the whole. And any kind of economic system could plunge into that and become a cancerous operation in that. And I think the only solution will be arising out of when humans move into their higher consciousness, choosing that. We have free will. It's a kind of a sometimes when you're wrestling with the spirit, it doesn't feel like free will when you want something and it turns out that you're running into a wall. It's like the spirit is saying no. It's like you don't really have free will to get what you want. However, when you surrender it to the spirit, the amount you get and what you need comes. It's I think the whole world is structured for this purpose, that we discover this in all our dealings with each other and in human life. And I think there's addiction operating when we get caught in wanting more than we need and focusing on that, because it's shutting out heaven. And I think Quakers are moving towards it. We're feeling that. And everyone here who spoke was speaking about it without labeling it this way. But I feel great hope when I hear people feeling the pain of addiction to anything but connection with our own higher self.
I think that one of the things that we're contemplating here is whether, even given the opportunity, people will make decisions that are based on the needs of the earth, the future generations, humanity itself, or life itself, extend beyond humanity, rather than our own desire for maximum ease and comfort or something like that. And that's perhaps a dilemma that I mean, that question is one that is unanswerable, but what we can do is recognize that corporations aren't set up, structured now to make decisions that are in the wider interest, the interests of all stakeholders. Get away from the word shareholders, but consider stakeholders, people who are affected by the decisions. And we should recognize that corporations, the idea of groups of people forming a corporation that will be of limited liability, that means, I mean, the whole idea of a corporation is that it can do things that go beyond its ability, much less the interest, to control the effects of. A company is set up with tax advantages, with the ability to do things that create risks, that put risks beyond what the capital is that it was initially capitalized with, so that the individuals who set up the corporation can do things and lose money, but they'll lose a limited amount of money, what they put into it. And that was a right that was given by nation states. That was a right that was legislated. And those rights can be taken away by the nation states, or there can be restrictions. They can be required to have other interests represented in making decisions. Our governments could say that corporations can't decide on their own. They have to decide with the interests of other people who are affected by them. That may be part of the step, at least in putting decisions of corporations more in the public eye, maybe putting them out to be the subject of more public debate that are now in private spheres, and having representation of workers, having representation of population groups that are affected by the corporate operations, people in other countries that are affected by the destruction of forests or the consumption of natural resources. Those are ways that at least we can begin to get more people aware of corporate decision-making, involved with corporate decision-making, see the need for changes in it.
Bob just gave me an idea that I've never had before, which is I've worked my entire life in the nonprofit sector, and nonprofits are not prohibited to lobby. And the theory is if we're making them tax deductible, if they don't pay any taxes, they shouldn't be able to influence policy. It would be quite something if we treated for-profit corporations the same way and prohibited them from lobbying. That might change things radically overnight.
I've been thinking too that following on what Bob said about the definition of a corporation as the conferral of legal personhood on the organization, which relieves the owners of some of the responsibility for its actions, that we never followed through with treating the personhood of the corporation the way we treat criminals. There should be a criminal code for the corporation, not just now if a corporation does something, you can try to criminally prosecute the people who ran it or did it, but you can't prosecute the corporation. You could sue it, but you can't prosecute it. And if corporations could be put in jail or executed for their crimes, you'd have to build a whole judicial infrastructure for that process. But they might act differently. If a corporation leaks, 1 billion gallons of oil into the Gulf, it ought to pay the price.
Let me just comment further a minute, because one of the things that I learned in my corporations class in law school was some of the reasoning, some of the philosophy as to why allow corporations to start off in the first place was because it was considered that you needed to have a massive of capital, massive money, larger than most individuals had, in order to be innovative and to take the risks, to do the great things like building a transcontinental railroad or building locomotives or manufacturing things at great scale. And you wanted to relieve them of the liabilities that might come about if it all went south. And so that's what corporations were started to do. They were to let people off the hook if things didn't work out.
George?
In the
Oh,
of
sorry.
To put another word in about the Norwegian practice, to a positive thing that has to do with what you've just been suggesting, regulation of corporations. One of the ways that corporations, of course, misbehave badly is outside their own country of origin, right? Treating people really, really badly. So Norway set up a law that said that if you're a Norwegian tourist and you're traveling somewhere in the world and you discover that a Norwegian corporation out there is doing something that would be against the law at home, you can call them on it. So if, for example, you're a Norwegian tourist in Chile and you hear they're doing fish farming, well, fish farming is something done in Norway. Oh, it's actually a Norwegian company that's doing fish farming here in Chile. Well, let me check it out. So you check it out, find out, oh, they're paying terrible wages here. And oh, look at that pollution that they're creating. When you go back home, you check in with the agency that's set up for you and you explain what you saw. The agency says, we'll get right on it. They do the research to nail the corporation that's doing that and haul them into court and penalize them for treating other people as they would not be allowed to treat Norwegians. So that's it. That would be a revolutionary step for US multinational corporations, and I can hardly wait.
Well, we're past our time, and I don't want to quench the spirit here. If there's someone who's keen to share something, I won't. I invite them to say so. But if not, then
Thank you so much, Steve. It was great.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Yes, it's been a
Appreciate
really
everybody.
rich conversation.
very provocative questions,
Mhm.
queries.
And rich history.
I'm going to go
Yeah.
have some Kit Kats right now.
I love Kit Kats myself. All right, friends. Be well.
Be well.